We're so glad that you could join us this afternoon. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Bob Allen. I'm the Assistant State Director for TNC here in New Jersey. Let's see, before we get started, just a couple of quick notes for those of you who maybe haven't gone through one of these presentations in the past. If you click on the speaker view button, which is in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, if you click on that, that's the best way to watch the presentation. If you have any questions, there's a chat button. It's in the sort of the center bottom of your screen, and you can just go ahead and type a question there, and we will do our best to answer all the questions that we can during the question and answer period. So today our presentation is by Patty Doerr. She is our Director of Coastal and Marine Programs. She's just celebrated her 10th anniversary, not terribly long ago, at TNC. Prior to joining the Conservancy, she spent over 10 years working in Washington, D.C. on a variety of environmental policy issues. She worked as staff for the Senate Environmental and Public Works Committee and other things. And before that, she got her master's from George Washington University in environmental policy. And before that, her bachelor's from New Jersey's own Rutgers in environmental policy. So with that, I'll turn it over to Patty for our presentation today.
Thank you so much, Bob, and I'm so happy everybody can join us this afternoon. I'm going to talk to you about the value of our salt marshes here in New Jersey and how TNC and others are investing in them in the face of sea level rise. Personally, I think they're the unsung heroes of the coastal world. Many people just think of them as those smelly, muddy, buggy islands of grass, which might all be true. But they're also just so much more than that, and they play an incredibly important role in our coastal communities. So I'm excited to share all of this with you today. I've included a few trivia questions for everybody this afternoon to keep you on your toes. So get ready to answer some questions throughout. Winners will get the bragging rights. That's all we can give you today virtually. But hopefully this is both fun and entertaining and informative all at once. So I know that there are beach people in this world and non-beach people in this world. I am totally a beach person and I love the shore. I grew up going to Long Beach Island with my brothers and my cousin, and I have the most amazing memories of us building sandcastles, floating on rafts in the ocean, being waist deep in the water looking for sand dollars with our toes. And there's a really great story of my aunt abandoning us in the water with a thunderstorm approaching with lightning and everything. She just took off. It's one of those great family stories that we bring out at the holidays. But now I go to see Isle City with my brothers and their families, and I get to watch my nieces and nephews form their own memories. I've taken my niece horseshoe crab counting. Great story around that. We saved turtles crossing the street. They love digging up sand crabs. That was the activity this past June. And I'm not alone in my love of going to the shore. It's evident every summer. And just by looking at the development down there, this picture was taken a couple of years ago in the month of May. But give it another month or so, the beach would be packed in a normal summer. Development on our barrier islands is just one indication that millions of us flock there every summer. And when people think of the shore in tourism, as soon as I said the shore, everybody thinks of the beaches. In 2017, tourism accounted for $43 billion of the state's economy, with nearly half of that, or $22 billion, associated with shore communities. But the Jersey Shore is so much more than just the beaches and the barrier islands. It's what I spend my time thinking about at work and talking about today are the big, beautiful green marshes that you see on the way to the islands. We're blessed with over 200,000 acres of salt marsh, and they also help to define the character of the shore. And they have so many great things. They do so many great things for us that many people aren't aware of. which is going to bring me to my very first trivia question before I get into those benefits. Lisa, if you could open up the poll question. Which benefit do marshes not provide us? Filtering water, controlling the wind, nursery for fish, or reducing wave and flood damage? Yes, control the wind. We got a majority going there. Excellent. Unfortunately, our marshes cannot control the wind, but they have some really amazing benefits for us. First off, they are the Brita filter for our bays. As rainwater comes off the surrounding lands and roads, the marshes act as a filter to help make the water swimmable and fishable within the bays, which is very important to a host of recreational activities like boating, kayaking, and of course, fishing, which leads me to the next benefit. They are critical to the life cycle of over 200 species of fish, many of which we rely on as part of our recreational and commercial fishing economies. Approximately 2/3 of the major U.S. commercial fisheries depend on our estuaries and salt marshes for nursery or spawning grounds. And this includes some really popular fish here in New Jersey, like menhaden, which is bunker, it's a bait fish, summer flounder, striped bass, and bluefish. And a couple of years ago, the University of Delaware did a study, and they looked at just these benefits and a couple others for the Barnegat Bay. And they estimated that the Barnegat Bay marshes contribute an economic value of $2 to $4 billion annually to the Jersey economy. And then in addition, they also help to reduce wave energy and by extension, storm damage, especially during more frequent, less intense storms. They do that by slowing down waves as they come ashore. So if you think about marshes as a shag carpet and waves as a marble, and as that marble is rolling across the bay, it's as if it's moving on a hardwood floor, sort of like moving left to right across the screen, if you can envision it. And then once that marble or the wave hits the shag carpet, it immediately slows down. It reduces the height of the wave and it reduces the energy of the wave. And that is what the marshes are doing. Marshes provide a 50% reduction in the energy of waves in the first 10 feet of marsh grass, and about a 60 to 80% reduction in height in the first 30 feet. So the more marshes we have, the bigger the savings. Shortly after Sandy, the Nature Conservancy did a study to put a dollar value on the damages avoided during Sandy from our marshes. Our global marine team partnered with the insurance industry to do this study, and they used the insurance risk models. They basically ran those models using the Sandy storm track with and without our coastal wetlands. It showed that during Sandy, the marshes throughout New Jersey decreased the damages to coastal communities by about $425 million. And that represents about a 27% savings in towns that still have wetlands. For a small number of communities that benefit, that might not have a lot of marsh, but benefit from all of the marshes downstream, that savings reached to over 100%. There's a town just south of Atlantic City, very small number of wetlands in their town, but they are benefiting from all of the wetlands downstream, and they saw 127% savings. So it can be pretty huge. In addition, they have that study team did a similar analysis specifically looking at the Barnegat Bay marshes in Ocean County, and they found that over 20 years, they looked not just Sandy, but over storms over the last 20 years, and found that they reduced flood damage by about 20% during those more frequent, but perhaps less intense storms. Unfortunately, both our coastal habitats and our coastal communities are facing a variety of hazards with climate change. The Mid-Atlantic is a hot spot for sea level rise due to the combination of the sea rising at an accelerated rate, and the land is actually sinking. Rutgers estimated that sea level in New Jersey has really accelerated and is actually rising twice as fast as the rest of the globe. And because of this, we're seeing a lot of changes along our coast. One of those is coastal erosion. According to DEP, 67% of New Jersey's coastline is at high or very high risk to coastal erosion. And the severity of this erosion, you know, some of it's natural, but the severity is increasing. This is a picture of the marsh in West Wildwood, New Jersey, in Cape May County. Ideally, there would be a soft slope down towards the water from the top of the marsh down, not these sharp edges and, you know, pieces really literally sloughing off. So what happens to the marsh as sea level rises? This is a ground level view of the marsh in Avalon in Cape May County with a really healthy amount of marsh. So you can just imagine as the wave is going across how that marsh grass is going to slow down the energy. Well, as tides come up during the normal tidal cycle, or it's flooded during the storm, that water is full of mud and sand. And the grass on the marsh helps to slow down the water and helps to trap the sand and mud that's suspended so it can trickle down and settle on top of the marsh and actually help the marsh grow taller. And as it grows taller, ideally it should, you know, keep pace with sea level rise. But with the accelerated pace of sea level rise, the grass is spending too much time sitting in that water, which causes it to be stunted in growth or die off. So basically, marshes have this really small window of an ideal elevation where it's not getting too much water, but it's getting enough water in order to remain healthy and keep the sediment trapping abilities. This is a picture of a degraded salt marsh in Avalon, actually at one of our project sites I'm going to talk about later. You can see the stunted marsh grass on the little island there in the beginning. It's much lower than the previous picture. Another thing that's happening with this marsh in Avalon is that there are pools on top of the marsh. This is at one of the pools. They can be naturally occurring, but again, with sea level rise, they're holding more water for too long, and the grasses at the edges begin to die and causing those pools to expand. So if the pools continue to expand to the point where they're meeting open water, you can really start to lose a lot of acres of marsh pretty quickly. As sea level rises, continues to rise, typically the next stage from this stunted vegetation, the marsh will turn into mud flats. So basically just a muddy bottom that's exposed at low tide, and then it turns into open water. So it's constantly covered with water. Our scientists at Rutgers have modeled where we expect these changes to happen. And I'm going to show you a little bit of that and sort of how it progresses. But before we do, we have our next trivia question. By how much has Rutgers University predicted the sea level will likely rise, an 85% chance, by 2050? And this would be from a 2000 baseline, the year 2000. 1 foot, 3 feet, 6 feet, or 8 feet? It's actually 1 feet, 1 foot of sea level rise. We've already have experienced about 4 inches between 2000 and 2020. So we're almost halfway there to that 1 foot. And again, to better understand where we expect to see the changes, Rutgers has modeled which marshes are most at risk to sea level rise and how much we are expected to lose. So I'm going to sort of walk you through kind of what this could look like in a particular area of New Jersey. This is a zoomed in area of marsh in the Barnegat Bay, Forked River, if you happen to be familiar with it. We have, if you can, hopefully you can see my mouse here, arrow. This is dark green is actually the Barnegat Bay. So this is open water. You got a couple of little boats zooming through here and up the channels. This sort of brownish green, this is the current salt marsh. And that flows into an upland forested area. This is the darker green. And then of course you have the communities surrounding it, which are benefiting most directly from these marshes. So what I'm going to do to help visualize this a little bit, I just tossed on a fluorescent green overlay that shows roughly the tidal marsh extent as of 2012. And then our first scenario is with that 1 foot of sea level rise. So this is the 85% chance that we're going to see this by 2050. We zoomed in a little bit more. We have the original fluorescent green from the 2012 salt marshes. And we start to see a little bit of this light teal blue. This is marsh that is expected to convert to mudflat. And this blue is marsh that we expect to turn into open water. And then actually this purple is areas where the marshes are going to migrate inland if they have the room to do so. And so the upland forest over time will convert to salt marsh. And so with this 1 foot of sea level rise, we are expected to lose about 20,000 acres of salt marsh around the state. So that's about a 10% marsh loss. And then the second scenario, if you notice, I'm going to go back, you got all this great fluorescent green, and with 2 feet of sea level rise, the vast majority of that green turns into the teal. This is converted to open water, to mudflat. And then the blue areas, we have a little bit more open water forming. This pool that was in here is getting bigger, and more of the marsh is migrating inland. So this is, Rutgers has estimated we would lose about 41,000 acres with 2 feet of sea level rise. Whether it's in 2050 or 2070, it's the foot level that matters the most. And that's about, the 41,000 acres is about 20% marsh loss in the state. This might seem daunting, but we do have some options and opportunities to address these challenges. One of those opportunities is actually connected to our boat channels, and more specifically, our constant routine need to keep those boat channels clear for safe navigation. And I'm going to explain that, but first, I'm going to have another trivia question for you. How many miles of boat channels do you think need to be maintained by New Jersey? 200? 700, 1,500 miles, or 3,000 miles of boat channels? It's all pretty even in there. This is fun to watch how this, I can see how the polling is going. So Lisa, if you could close the poll. Answer is actually over 700 miles of boat channels in New Jersey. And they need to be maintained much like we need to maintain our interstate highway and our local roads. There are federal, state, and local channels that have to be dredged and cleared periodically so boats and ships can pass without getting stuck. When they're not routinely cleared, many boats, even small ones, can't get through at low tide without risk of running aground, which is actually something that has happened to our coastal team on more than one occasion. But the green lines on this map are the federal channels that are maintained by the Army Corps of Engineers in Philadelphia. They have over 550 miles of channels. This long green line that goes through the back bays of New Jersey, in between the barrier islands and the mainland. This is the intercoastal waterway. So the intercoastal waterway actually connects Maine to Florida. And this is the New Jersey portion that they have to keep clear. And in addition to this, the state of New Jersey maintains an additional 230 miles or so. They're not on this map, but they typically connect local marinas and local lagoon communities to these federal channels, sorry. But here's the challenge. Those doing the dredging need to find a place to put all of that mud and sand that they're digging up. And historically, all of this mud or sand, which we also call sediment, has gone into what are basically landfills on the marsh. This one on the left-hand side, this little mountain or hill, is one in Cape May County. It's incredibly noticeable. The Army Corps of Engineers had staff visiting last year, and apparently they were driving over into the barrier islands and they're like, what are those pimples on the marsh? So they really stick out. So if you're ever down the shore and you see them now, you know what this is. There are two issues with this approach. The first is that these landfills are basically full and the state is not permitting any new ones. So in order to put in material, you have to empty out an existing landfill, which can be very cost prohibitive. The second is that by doing this, we're actually taking this mud and the sand out of the water, out of the marsh and bay ecosystem, which adds another challenge to the ability of marshes to grow. If there's less sediment in the water, there's less growth of marshes. So to help meet the needs of both the marshes and the boat channels of the state, TNC and partners have begun investing in an innovative technique. We're actually beneficially using that clean mud and sand clogging the boat channels to help restore and enhance the salt marshes so that they can better persist and stick around in the face of sea level rise to provide all of those benefits I was talking about. There's actually a few different ways to beneficially use dredge material. For habitat restoration, you can recreate marsh islands, actually rebuild islands that have been lost, can stabilize the marsh edges to help reduce that erosion that I was talking about earlier, or you can even fill old lagoons that were dredged for development but weren't actually developed. But one specific way that we've recently tested here in New Jersey is to dredge up that mud and sand from the boat channel and then pump it up onto the top of a marsh that is drowning. And that is what this picture is here in Middle Township. By doing that, we're putting sediment on top of the marsh to help them grow taller. TNC was actually part of a large project team led by New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection that piloted this technique in Cape May and Cumberland counties shortly after Sandy. And that's the project I'm going to give you guys a quick overview on. Here are the 3 project locations. So we're actually in South Jersey, excuse me. This is the Cape May Peninsula. This is the Delaware Bay and the great state of Delaware across the bay. We had 3 different projects. The first was in Middle Township. The second was in Avalon. And the third was in Fortescue. And we did these over the course of 3 years, and we took what we learned from each site and applied it to the next site to help improve the design and construction. Other partners included the Army Corps of Engineers, which dredged the federal channel near Avalon and Middle Township, and then the New Jersey Department of Transportation dredged the state channel in Fortescue, as well as a number of other conservation nonprofits and consulting firms were on this project team. To give you an idea of how the projects were constructed, I'm going to walk you through the project on the marshes behind Avalon. Oh, and I should say, I apologize. So through this project and those 3 sites, we restored or enhanced 47 acres of marsh using about 6,000 dump trucks full of sediment from the clogged channels, which was about 61,000 cubic yards of mud and sand. So here's an aerial picture of the Avalon site, which was the largest. Again, this was the second project location. The Army Corps needed to clear a part of the intercoastal waterway, again, which runs the length of New Jersey. That's this red line on the map. It's the channel they needed to clear. Here is the town of Avalon on the barrier islands. And these green fluorescent blobs is where we placed the material that was dredged from the boat channel. They were identified by TNC and others as being particularly low in elevation, with a fair number of those expanding pools that I talked about. And we actually did this project in 2 phases over the course of 2 winters from 2014 to 2016. And all in all, restored 40 acres with about 5,500 dump trucks full of material. Here is just another aerial shot. I kind of twisted you around a little bit. We have the numbered areas that helps the project team keep track of what was happening in each area. To construct the project, we ringed these areas with coconut fiber logs, which are exactly what they sound like, logs made out of coconut fiber. I have a picture coming up next. But we ringed the areas and then pumped the material into each spot. And the coconut fiber logs really helped to contain that mud and sand as it moved around the marsh. Some of the spots just got a few inches of material based on how low in elevation it already was, but in others, we were actually testing out how to fill those pools that I was talking about, so they got much more material. Here are some additional pools to get sort of an idea of what they look like from the air. I'm going to bring you down to marsh level here. On the right are the coconut fiber logs that I had talked about. You can see it's winter time. The marsh grass has turned brown. And then on the left here is the spraying in action. And you can see the slurry coming out. And slurry is just it's a mix of seawater, mud, sand, all that material coming up out of the channel and being pumped on the marsh. And depending how much sediment the marsh needed, the dredgers would pump until that slurry reached about the height of the logs, and then they would pause for a few hours to let that marsh absorb the water, just like if you were watering your house plant. So you just watch the water be absorbed by the soil, and then that would leave the mud and the sand behind. And once the desired height of the mud and sand was reached for a particular area, they would move the dredge to the next location and repeat. And that process took about 3 or 4 months. And then here is another ground level shot. A year or two after placement, there are some remnants of the coconut fiber logs. We did remove the coconut fiber logs after the project was complete so that the water could, during the normal tidal cycle and during storms, could move freely over the marsh. As part of the project team, TNC coordinated the monitoring effort, which included several partners who are looking at a wide variety of things. Like, did we hit the right elevation with the material? Is the water moving across the marsh properly during the tidal cycle? How's the chemistry of the new soil we created, right? All of this is basically new soil. Is the water chemistry good for allowing the vegetation to grow back? And what was the impact on the birds, crabs, and other animals that use the marsh? TNC ourselves, we conducted the vegetation monitoring. So it was our job to see just how fast it took for these areas to revegetate. Many of the things that, many things go into the monitoring, but one primary activity was actually to measure the length of blades of grass in hundreds of different monitoring plots, which I thought made for a really fun trivia question. So here is the next one. Lisa, if you could pop it up. How many blades of grass did our coastal team measure in 2019? 100, 500, 1,000, or 2,000? All right, Lisa, if we could close the poll, that would be great. Yes, most of you did get it right. It was nearly 2,000 blades of grass, 1,920 to be exact. And this is just some proof that yes, they did actually measure blades of grass. These gentlemen are Doug and Dave they were our coastal field staff from last summer. They, along with Adriana Zito Livingston, who led this monitoring team, did most of the monitoring last summer. So they're the ones that went out, they braved the heat, they braved some storms and lots of biting greenhead flies, which actually I love going out there with them. It was a ton of fun. But what did we find with all of this monitoring? How are the marshes doing? What we're finding is that nature is amazing at its ability to fix itself. They are revegetating. This is a plot in Avalon. And on the far left, you can see a picture. It started out as a pool that we filled up. And over the course of 4 years, it's bounced back. It's on track. to recovery. It's on track compared to similar projects around the world. And if it remains on its current track, we should see full recovery in about 3 or 4 years. We would like all of these marshes to be covered by more than 60% of marsh grass. That is sort of our ideal grass coverage to get them ahead of the curve with sea level rise. With the multiple years of monitoring, we're starting to see different trends, which helps us to better understand what's really driving recovery at each location. Here at Avalon, the driving factor in recovery seems to be the elevation of the constructed projects. So do we hit that right elevation where the grass isn't too wet or too dry? And also we found that the vegetation is coming back quickly where it's closest to the surviving vegetation. So if there were clumps of grass that survived the placement or from the edges, marsh grass grows by rhizomes under the soil. And so that's where the grass is coming back fastest. So I started out this call talking about how much we adore the shore, but more importantly, that we need to be investing in our salt marshes. Without them, I think we lose a major part of not just the character, but the economic underpinning of our coastal community. And they're just a major natural asset to the state. This idea of beneficial use really has the potential to address multiple challenges facing our coastal habitats, and TNC is working with our partners throughout the state to start thinking about how to transform the management of our coasts and our marshes so that we have something akin to our state's beach and dune nourishment program. We should be able to get there for our marshes as well. We need to get more projects on the ground so we can continue to refine how to do projects in the most efficient way possible, while also maximizing the benefit to the marshes so that then, again, they can get ahead of the curve when it comes to sea level rise. The rate of sea level rise is increasing. We need to help the marshes, the rate of marsh elevation growth increase as well. We also need to refine where are the best places to do these projects and when to do them in a particular area. You know, the coastal environment is a very dynamic system, so we need to decide of the marshes we think we're going to lose, which ones are most important from either a wildlife or a community resilience perspective, and by when do we need to take that action. This is going to help us plan out a nourishment cycle that makes the most sense for the marshes. This all has to be driven by what the marshes need. We did some really rough internal calculations, and we think that with just the current dredging backlog of what needs to be dredged right now from a federal and a state perspective, we could treat about 20% of the most at-risk marshes on the Atlantic coast over the next 5 years or so. So where are the best places to do that? And then what's the next set of marshes that we address with the continued dredging needs? We're just at the beginning, which I think is really, truly exciting. And we have a really wonderful group of partners that want to tackle all of this, to tackle these really big questions. So it's just very exciting to me and the rest of the coastal team. And in the meantime, we get to play in mud, which I always look for a good excuse to that. And that leads me to my final trivia question as I wrap up here. What item did the coastal team find in the marsh during its monitoring over the last 5 years or so? An inflatable unicorn, my water bottle, 3 lost cell phones of the TNC staff, or a handheld GPS unit? Yes, you guys were right. We did find an inflatable unicorn and we lost everything else. So this was, please secure your pool and beach toys, that would be great. So I also mentioned, just very quickly, I mentioned earlier in the presentation that the erosion of the marsh edge is also a challenge facing the marshes. It's not just the platform. This idea of beneficially using dredged material can also be used to build back the edges of marshes, lost to erosion, and at the same time reduce the erosive forces through a technique called living shorelines. So next week, Bill Shadle, our coastal projects manager, is going to be talking about the different ways that technique can be used in the state. So I hope you join us for that, and I am happy to answer any questions.
Okay, Patty, our first question. What are some of the biggest lessons learned during the pilot projects?
There were so many. This was one of the very first projects done in the state, and they were incredibly complicated. And I think the biggest takeaway is that we very much you need to have an interdisciplinary team that includes ecologists, engineers, and dredgers at the minimum. You also want like the landowners and other partners, but you need these three. They're kind of the key members of a project team, and they need to be very coordinated from the beginning. They have to be talking from the moment you conceive of the project to determine what does the marsh need in terms of the type of material and how much of it, and then what is needed from the dredging perspective of that nearby channel. You know, how do you match those up from a design perspective? And then as you go, you're constantly adapting and iterating your plans and figuring out what works and doesn't work. And so you really need to be talking all the time. You need to be talking to the state and federal permitters as well. And nothing ever goes as planned. I mean, these are construction projects. So if you think of any sort of construction project from like home improvement to like building roads, nothing goes as planned. And so you have to be willing to adapt along the way. And the more you're talking, the easier it is to adapt and figure things out. So I think that's one. And then the second would be to be okay with not over designing these these projects. Nature is constantly changing, right? And you could get all the measurements that you need, all the baseline data for what the marsh needs, and think you know what's in the channel, and you can continue to build, but nature has sort of its own way of dealing with things. And so the less you over design, the more you're able to adapt and recognize that nature is going to continue to change, and it's going to continue to fix itself. And so if you can adapt along the way and give it a chance and see what it does.
Okay, here's another one. Where in New Jersey would the idea of beneficial use make the most sense?
Well, actually, we know from other analysis done by the Nature Conservancy that there are areas in New Jersey that we consider coastal strongholds, or the areas of marsh that are most likely to persist because they have room to move, there's enough sediment in the system, and the water quality is better. And so we have done that analysis at the Nature Conservancy coastwide. And then here in New Jersey, our coastal strongholds are the Delaware Bay, the Mulcove River and Great Bay, which is just north of Atlantic City, and the Great Egg Harbor River and Bay, which is behind Ocean City. So those are actually areas that probably wouldn't need this technique. So what we need to look at are those areas where the marshes are converting and where we have the most boat channels. And so we think the most potential is on the Atlantic coast in the back bays. Or the back bays being those areas between the barrier islands and the mainland. There's a variety of need from a marsh perspective there. Elevation help, the shoreline erosion, a lot of mosquito ditching and marsh management techniques that have impacted the integrity of the marshes. And there's also a really fair amount of those landfills on the marsh that need to be emptied. So there's just a lot of potential there from both the marsh need perspective and the dredging need.
Okay, here's another question, Patty. If sea level will continue to rise, how long will each of these types of projects last?
So that's a good question. So as I mentioned in my presentation, our coastline is very dynamic. It's a coastal system, and no two marshes are the same, and they don't need the same thing. So it's actually kind of a hard question to answer. Each project should be designed to maximize the ecological benefits for the marsh, and so the marsh can quickly provide all of those benefits that I talked about before. So depending on the project and the location, the ecologists and the engineers and the need to decide what each of the projects look like and govern how much time can be bought for that marsh to get them ahead of the curve of sea level rise. But the beauty of these projects is that there's always going to be a need to maintain boat channels. So if we set up that nourishment program that I was talking about, we can go back and revisit project sites. So if we can do a project and we've bought that marsh an additional 15 years, there's nothing to say that in 20 years or in 15 or 20 years, we don't go back and give things a little bit of a boost. So yeah.
Okay, we have another question, but I think maybe I'll open it up to some of the other TNC staff who are on the call. It's actually about one of our upcoming events. And the question is, what is centering equity and inclusion? I'm thinking that maybe Bob Allen or Carrie might be able to answer that one.
Yeah, I can answer that. So that presentation is going to be done by Tanisha Malcolm, who is our fairly new, she started in late March, director of our urban conservation work. And so her presentation is going to be particularly about how to be thoughtful about local communities, how to be thoughtful about racial equity, racial injustice, and so on in the building of those projects together with places, the implementation, even like sort of the goals of the project. And you know, that's not something that the conservation groups have always been great at, and it's something we're trying to put very much like an increased emphasis on. And so she's going to be talking about where we're going with some of that work.
That's it for our questions, but we'd like everyone to stay on and visit with staff for the next few minutes.
Sue, there's one more question from Carrie in the chat box. No, it just popped up.
Oh, okay. Go ahead.
No, Carrie was asking how I feel about the likelihood that these nature-based solutions would be broadly accepted and implemented. I am feeling incredibly confident that they will be. Broadly speaking, within the state, there is high level of support for an understanding of the importance of our salt marshes. We want to keep our wetlands intact in the face of climate change for all of those benefits that I had mentioned at the beginning of my presentation. And at the same time, especially the New Jersey Department of Transportation, that they need to dredge these channels, see a potential avenue to help solve their problem. And so there have been some really great discussions at higher levels in DEP and Department of Transportation, specifically on beneficial use and the potential for really establishing a way to get us beyond our current state of project by project, but very much thinking holistically about the Atlantic coast. So that's beneficial use specific, very specifically. And broadly speaking, our Department of Environmental Protection has been very supportive of all kinds of nature-based solutions. Floodplain restoration in our rivers, living shorelines as well, green infrastructure for stormwater in cities. It is something that they have indicated is going to be an important part of a statewide climate resilience plan.
Okay, another question. What's been the response and interest from towns and beach communities in this work?
Incredibly responsive. Once we started actually doing the project in Lower Township in Avalon shortly after Sandy, there were a number of additional towns that have started to kickstart their own projects to varying levels of success. There was one project where they didn't bring in the ecologists from the very beginning, and it was deemed too much of a dredging project. So again, going back to my lessons learned of having an interdisciplinary team, if you don't have those ecologists on the team, it's going to be harder to get the projects going. But the town really wanted this to happen. There's another project getting started in Ocean City where they are looking to do looking at a 100-acre marsh and doing this combination of protecting the edge and reducing the erosion while also building back the top of the marsh. So it's been something that has piqued the interest of a variety of communities for, a couple of different reasons.
Okay, thanks. Now that looks like that is the end of the questions. So over to you, Bob.
All right. Well, I can wrap this up. Thanks so much to all of you for listening and participating today. We're so deeply grateful for your continued support for our conservation work. It's even more important all the time, and we hope you will enjoy or join us for the next event in our Conservation Connection series. And Patty mentioned it earlier. It's called Living Shorelines, a Nature-Inspired Response to Back Bay Erosion. And that's going to be by Bill Shadell, who is on Patty's team. And that is going to be on Wednesday, September 2nd from 1 to 2 p.m. And at this point, if you want to go back up to that upper right-hand corner and click on Gallery View, that's an easy way to be able to see everybody on camera, and we can say hello and chit-chat a bit, and then move on to the rest of our days. And for staff, go ahead and turn on your videos so that people can see you and you're not just a mysterious name with a dark background.